Welcome to my channel. Here, we share inspiring stories of brave and strong people. Maybe you'll see yourself or someone you know in these stories. Thank you for watching. Frank Carter's mornings were always the same. A steaming cup of black coffee. A faded photograph of his unit in Normandy. And the oppressive quiet of an empty house. Decades had passed since the war. But the silence still reminded him of what he'd lost. The garden outside, once vibrant, had long surrendered to weeds. Much like Frank had surrendered to his solitude. But the sound of rustling in the overgrown bushes one crisp morning brought an unexpected visitor, a limping Belgian Malinois, with a story written in its cautious eyes. Frank didn't know it yet. But the dog would drag him back into a fight he thought he'd left behind. A battle to reclaim something he didn't realize he was missing. Leave a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. If you enjoy stories like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring journey tomorrow. Frank Carter woke before the sun. Though there wasn't much to wake up for anymore. The early morning light crept through the kitchen window, stretching across the worn surface of the table where he sat. His fingers curled around a mug of black coffee, its heat doing little to thaw the cold ache in his chest. Across from him sat a second mug. Unused but not forgotten. His late wife, Eleanor, had once insisted on starting the day with a quiet breakfast together. That cup had been hers. And though she was long gone, Frank couldn't bring himself to put it away. The house around him was silent, orderly to the point of sterility. A small photograph in a tarnished silver frame sat on the windowsill. In it, a younger Frank stood tall in his paratrooper's uniform, surrounded by his unit. Their faces were resolute, marked with the grit of war and the fleeting hope of survival. Frank's gaze flicked to it briefly before shifting to the window. The photograph belonged to a life he no longer recognized. The backyard was just as tired as the man who tended it. Eleanor's once pristine garden had surrendered to weeds. Their stubborn growth a quiet rebellion against Frank's half-hearted attempts to maintain order. He moved through it mechanically most mornings, clipping at branches or pulling at roots, though he knew the battle was long lost. "Morning," Frank called a neighbor from across the fence. Her voice was cheerful, but her eyes betrayed concern as she watched him shuffle through the yard. "Morning," Frank replied without looking up. His tone was gruff but polite, a shield he rarely lowered. By late afternoon, Frank was back on the porch, a familiar perch where he spent hours watching the world move on without him. A faded photograph rested in his hand, the same one from the kitchen. The faces in the picture stared back at him, frozen in a moment of camaraderie before Normandy changed everything. His thumb brushed over one face in particular, Eddie, his best friend, smiling broadly as if unaware of the chaos that would soon engulf them. Frank closed his eyes, the memory sharp and unyielding. The sound of rustling broke his reverie. He opened his eyes and scanned the edge of the yard. Something moved in the shadows of the overgrowth. Frank squinted, his hand tightening on the arm of his chair. A shape emerged, a dog, lean and wiry, with a coat of short tan fur and a black mask across its face. It was a Belgian Malinois, he realized, though it looked worse for wear. The dog's ribs were faintly visible, and it limped slightly as it nosed through the bushes, searching for something. Frank straightened in his chair, the photograph slipping to his lap. The Malinois noticed him and froze. Its ears pricked and its dark eyes locked on his. For a moment, neither moved. The dog's gaze was steady, guarded but unafraid. It reminded Frank of something or someone, but he couldn't place it. Before he could make a sound, the dog turned and bolted, its lean frame disappearing through a gap in the fence. Frank sat still, staring at the empty space where the dog had been. He felt a strange pang, sharp and unexpected, like a memory he didn't know he'd forgotten. That look in the dog's eyes had stirred something he thought had been buried long ago. It wasn't just the dog's state, the limp, the thinness, but the way it had held itself, proud, even in hardship. The next morning, Frank stepped onto the porch and stopped short. Muddy paw prints crossed the steps and disappeared into the garden. He stared at them, his hand gripping the porch railing. His gaze flicked to the gap in the fence. But the yard was empty. For the first time in years, Frank felt a pull of curiosity. A whisper of something he couldn't name. He glanced down at the photograph in his hand. The faces of his comrades staring back at him. The silence of the house remained. But now, it felt less absolute. Frank first noticed the muddy paw prints on his porch steps. They crisscrossed the wooden boards, leading from the overgrown garden to the corner where he'd left a plate of scrambled eggs he hadn't had the appetite to finish. The plate was empty now. Licked clean. He stood there for a moment, the chill of the morning air biting at his skin, before returning inside without a word. Over the next few days, the dog returned like clockwork. Frank caught glimpses of it skulking through the brush, its tan coat blending into the autumn shadows. He began leaving scraps out intentionally, half a sandwich, a handful of crackers, and watched from the window as the dog approached. Cautious and alert. The limp in its step was more noticeable when it slowed. Each movement deliberate, as though testing the ground for traps. The more Frank observed, the more he noticed peculiarities about the dog. One afternoon, as a small plane flew overhead, the Malinois froze mid-step, its head snapping upward. Its ears stood tall, eyes tracking the aircraft until it disappeared. The intensity of the dog's focus was unsettling. It reminded Frank of the soldiers he'd trained who were always on high alert, anticipating danger where none seemed to exist. Then there were the commands. Frank wasn't even sure why he tried at first. He had muttered stay absent-mindedly through the window one morning. More habit than intention. To his surprise, the dog halted, its body tensing for a fraction of a second before it relaxed and trotted toward the plate of food. Frank tried again a day later with Find, pointing to where he'd hidden a biscuit behind a nearby rock. The dog sniffed the air, hesitated, then found the treat with unnerving precision. "Where'd you come from?" Frank murmured to himself, watching the dog through the glass. The question lingered unanswered. One afternoon, while the dog was pawing at the ground near a patch of wildflowers, Frank noticed something unusual. A faint mark, like a tattoo, just inside the dog's ear. It was too faded to make out clearly from a distance, but its existence sent a ripple of curiosity through him. This dog wasn't just a stray. It had a history, a purpose, though what that was remained a mystery. When the dog wasn't in the yard, Frank found himself scanning the horizon, waiting for its return. Once, he caught it sitting at the edge of the street, watching a family walk by with their golden retriever. The Malinois stayed perfectly still, its gaze locked on the family until they disappeared around the corner. It didn't bark or approach, just sat there, its loneliness as palpable as the cold wind cutting across the yard. Frank knew that feeling. He recognized it as surely as he recognized his own reflection in the mirror. The longing for something lost, the quiet ache of emptiness. It reminded him of Normandy. The memory came unbidden, as it often did, parachuting into enemy territory under the cover of darkness, the adrenaline masking the fear that clawed at the edges of his mind. He could still hear the sharp crack of gunfire and the cries of his unit as chaos erupted around them. He could see Eddie, his best friend, grinning at him just moments before everything went wrong. The weight of Eddie's helmet in his hands was as vivid now as it had been then. A heavy reminder of what he couldn't fix, of what he'd left behind. Frank blinked, the memory fading as his eyes refocused on the Malinois now sniffing at the plate of scraps he'd left out. It looked up suddenly, its dark eyes meeting his through the window. For a moment, neither moved. Then the dog turned and limped away into the fading light. He felt the stirrings of something he hadn't in years, responsibility. Not the reluctant obligation of maintaining the house or the empty effort of keeping the garden from overtaking the yard, but something deeper. The kind of responsibility that came with knowing someone or something needed you as much as you needed them. Frank sat back in his chair, the dog's image lingering in his mind. He didn't have answers yet, but for the first time in years, he felt a pull toward finding them. The storm rolled in faster than Frank expected. By early evening, the sky had turned a muted gray, thick with the promise of rain. He stood at the kitchen window, watching as the first drops streaked down the glass. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and ominous, and a gust of wind rattled the porch door. Frank clenched his jaw, memories stirring unbidden. The sound of distant artillery was never far from his mind. Even all these years later, a movement on the edge of the yard caught his attention. The dog, lean and drenched, emerged from the shadows. Its tan coat darkened by the rain. It limped toward the porch, its head low, ears flicking nervously at the sound of thunder. Frank's hand hovered over the latch for a moment before he opened the door. The cold air rushed in, bringing with it the smell of wet earth and a sharp edge of tension. "Well, you're a stubborn one, aren't you?" Frank muttered, stepping aside to let the dog in. The Malinois hesitated, its body stiff and uncertain. But the warmth of the house seemed to win out. It crossed the threshold cautiously, its paws leaving muddy prints on the worn floorboards. Frank grabbed an old towel from the kitchen and crouched down, extending it toward the dog. "Let's get you dry." The dog flinched at first but didn't retreat. Slowly, Frank dabbed at its fur, careful not to startle it. The damp coat smelled of rain and wildness, a scent both foreign and familiar. As he worked, Frank found himself speaking softly, his words half to the dog, half to himself. "Haven't had a visitor in a while. Used to have a dog, a mutt Eleanor found near the highway. Best dog we ever had. You'd have liked her." The dog's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but it made no move to leave. Instead, it sat on the floor, watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes. Frank's hand slowed as he noticed the faint tattoo in its ear again. He squinted, trying to make sense of it, but the letters were too faded to read. "You've got a story, don't you?" Frank said, almost to himself. "Guess we both do." The storm outside grew louder, lightning illuminating the room in sharp flashes. The dog tensed, its muscles coiling as the thunder boomed. But it didn't bolt. Frank gave it space, moving to the old armchair by the fireplace. He sat heavily, leaning back as the dog curled into the corner of the room. Its gaze followed him, watchful but no longer weary. The next morning, Frank found himself moving with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He cleared a small corner of the living room, dragging an old blanket from the hall closet and smoothing it into a makeshift bed. He rearranged the furniture slightly, opening up the space. It wasn't much, but it was something. Later that day, as he watched the dog sniffing cautiously around the yard, Frank tried an old command out of habit. "Stay," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. To his surprise, the Malinois froze, its body tense, ears pricked forward. It stayed perfectly still until Frank added, "Okay, go on." The dog relaxed, trotting toward a plate of food Frank had left on the porch. Frank stood there for a moment, blinking. The response was instinctive, trained. It confirmed what he'd suspected: this dog had a history, one rooted in discipline and purpose. As the days passed, their interactions grew easier, the silences less heavy. Frank began talking more, his words flowing in quiet, unhurried tones. He spoke of Eleanor, of the war, of his friend Eddie whose helmet still sat on the mantel. "We were just kids," he said one afternoon, staring at the dog as if it might understand. "Had no idea what we were getting into." The dog listened, or at least that's how it felt. It would sit near him, its eyes steady, its tail giving the occasional hesitant wag. For the first time in years, Frank didn't feel like he was talking to himself. The breakthrough came one morning when Frank reached out, almost without thinking, and brushed his hand across the dog's head. The Malinois stiffened for a moment, then relaxed, leaning slightly into his touch. Frank felt something uncoil in his chest, a knot of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "Well," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, "I guess we're figuring this out." If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel, it means so much to us. Now, let's get back to the story. The day started like any other. Frank opened the back door to let the cool morning air sweep through the house. Scout, as he'd started calling the Malinois, lingered near the edge of the porch, his sharp eyes scanning the garden. Frank leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, sipping his coffee as he watched the dog explore. It was becoming a routine, one he hadn't realized he'd come to rely on. The sound of a child's laughter carried across the yard. The neighbor's boy, riding his bicycle along the cracked sidewalk, waved as he passed. Frank returned the gesture with a faint nod. The boy often left the gate open when retrieving stray balls from Frank's yard, though Frank hadn't paid much attention to it before. Today, though, the gate swung wide, unnoticed as the boy darted off. By the time Frank realized Scout was gone, the yard was eerily quiet. He set his coffee down, scanning the space where the dog had been moments earlier. The open gate confirmed his worst fear. "Scout!" Frank called, his voice firm, echoing across the empty yard. There was no response. Panic gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. But Frank tamped it down. He grabbed his jacket and flashlight, muttering to himself as he hurried out the gate. A storm was brewing in the distance, the sky heavy with gray clouds. The wind had picked up, tugging at the branches overhead. Time was running short. Frank bent low to the ground, searching for signs of Scout's path. Muddy paw prints led toward the woods, faint but discernible. Years of military training kicked in, and Frank found himself falling into old habits, scanning for tracks, noting broken branches, and marking his path mentally. His body protested the effort, each step a reminder of his age. But he pressed on. The woods loomed ahead, dark and foreboding under the thickening clouds. "Scout!" Frank shouted again, his voice cutting through the rising wind. A flash of movement to his right caught his attention. But when he turned, there was nothing. Frustration built in his chest, but he forced himself to stay methodical. He couldn't afford to lose focus. As he moved deeper into the trees, a flashback hit him like a physical blow. The woods transformed into the dense terrain of Normandy, the air thick with smoke and the deafening roar of gunfire. He saw Eddie's face, the panic in his eyes as he called out for help. The weight of Eddie's helmet in his hands, so real, so vivid, blurred the line between past and present. Frank stopped, leaning against a tree, and closed his eyes. He breathed deeply, grounding himself in the present. The sounds of the storm brought him back. This wasn't Normandy. He wasn't that young soldier anymore. But Scout needed him now, just as Eddie had back then. And this time, he wouldn't fail. The storm broke just as Frank reached a clearing. Rain lashed at his face, cold and relentless, soaking through his jacket. He nearly slipped on the slick ground as he called out again. "Scout!" A faint whimper cut through the noise, barely audible over the storm. Frank's heart leapt as he turned toward the sound. There, at the bottom of a shallow ravine, lay Scout. The dog was tangled in a cluster of roots, his leg pinned awkwardly beneath him. His coat was matted with mud, and his eyes were wide with fear. Frank scrambled down the slope, his old joints protesting every movement. "It's okay, boy," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "I'm here." Scout growled low in his throat, more out of fear than aggression. Frank knelt carefully, extending a hand. "It's just me, Scout. You're okay." The dog hesitated but didn't pull away, his trust barely holding. With a grunt of effort, Frank freed Scout's leg from the tangle. He examined it quickly, bruised but not broken. Rain streamed down his face as he lifted the dog into his arms. The weight was substantial, pressing against his chest as he stood. His knees wobbled under the strain, but he didn't falter. The climb back up the slope was grueling. Each step sent pain shooting through his legs and back, but he ignored it. Scout trembled in his arms, his wet fur cold against Frank's skin. "Almost there," Frank muttered through clenched teeth, the rain muffling his words. "We're almost there." When they finally reached the edge of the woods, the sight of the house in the distance filled Frank with relief. Scout stirred weakly, his eyes meeting Frank's for a fleeting moment. The gratitude in that look was unmistakable, and it struck something deep in Frank. He had made it in time. By the time they reached the porch, both man and dog were soaked and exhausted. Frank set Scout down gently, his own legs nearly giving out as he sank onto the steps. The storm raged on, but for the first time in years, Frank felt a calm settle over him. He had done what he couldn't in Normandy. He had brought someone home. Frank woke the next morning with his body aching in ways it hadn't in years. His back screamed as he stretched, the weight of the previous day's rescue still fresh in his muscles. Scout lay on the old blanket Frank had placed in the corner of the living room. His injured leg stretched out awkwardly. The dog's eyes fluttered open as Frank shuffled closer, a wary but trusting gaze meeting his. "How's the leg, boy?" Frank asked softly. Crouching down with a grunt, he ran a careful hand along Scout's limb, feeling for swelling. The dog flinched but didn't pull away, his trust fragile but present. "You'll be all right," Frank muttered. "Tougher than you look." Scout licked his nose in response, a small gesture that made Frank's chest tighten. For a moment, he sat there, hand resting gently on the dog's side, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. It had been a long time since he'd felt responsible for anything other than the weeds in his yard. Frank knew he needed to take action. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but it needed attention. He made a makeshift splint from an old wooden spoon and medical tape he'd dug out of a dusty first aid kit. His movements were deliberate, his hands steadier than they'd been in years. As he wrapped Scout's leg, the dog let out a soft whine but stayed still. "You've been through worse, haven't you?" Frank murmured. He thought of the tattoo in Scout's ear, the sharp way he responded to commands, the focused alertness that hinted at a past far more disciplined than Frank's quiet backyard. By midday, the rain had subsided, leaving the world outside damp and quiet. Frank carried Scout to the porch, setting him down gently on the old wooden boards. The dog sniffed the air cautiously, his tail giving the faintest wag. Frank sat beside him, his own legs stretched out stiffly. "You remind me of someone," Frank said, his voice quiet. He stared into the distance, his mind drifting back to Normandy. Eddie had that same look about him, always ready, always watching. "We thought we were invincible back then." Scout turned his head toward Frank, ears twitching as though he were listening. Frank continued, the words spilling out in a way they hadn't in years. "We lost Eddie on a recon mission. Ambush. I was supposed to be there. Supposed to cover him." His voice faltered, thick with emotion. "But I wasn't fast enough." The memory weighed heavily, as it always did. But this time it didn't crush him. Instead, it felt lighter, shared. Scout's steady presence seemed to anchor him, the quiet companionship easing the burden. Frank looked down at the dog, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're not Eddie, though, are you? You're you. And you're here." The following days were a slow but steady process of recovery. Scout hobbled around the house with Frank close behind, the splint on his leg a constant reminder of their shared effort. Frank coaxed him into eating heartier meals, using scraps of leftover chicken and gravy as bribes. With each passing day, Scout's tail wagged a little more freely, his steps becoming less tentative. One morning, Frank decided to test something. He stood in the backyard, Scout resting nearby on the porch, and gave a sharp, clear command, "Stay." Scout's ears perked up immediately, his body stilling like a coiled spring. Frank took a step back, then another. The dog didn't move. "Okay," Frank called, his voice softer. Scout trotted toward him, the limp still noticeable but less pronounced. Frank crouched down as the dog approached, scratching behind his ears. "Good boy," he said, the praise coming naturally. "Knew you had it in you." That evening, as they sat together on the porch, Frank found himself thinking about second chances. Scout's journey was still uncertain, his past a mystery and his future no more guaranteed than anyone else's. But sitting there with the dog leaning against his leg, Frank felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. "You saved me as much as I saved you," Frank said softly, his hand resting on Scout's head. The dog closed his eyes, his tail thumping lightly against the porch. Frank leaned back, letting the stillness settle around them. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were both going to be all right. Scout's recovery was slow, But every small step forward felt like a victory. By the end of the week, the Malinois moved with more confidence, his limp less pronounced. Frank watched him carefully, noting each change with the precision of someone used to observing the smallest details. Scout seemed to feed off Frank's attention, responding to his commands with growing eagerness. One morning, Frank stood in the yard, holding a small rubber ball he'd found buried in the garage. "Let's see what you've got," he murmured, tossing it a few feet ahead. Scout hesitated, his body tensing, before limping toward the ball and nudging it with his nose. When he looked back at Frank, tail wagging faintly, Frank felt a pang of pride he hadn't known in years. "You're starting to come around," Frank said, tossing the ball again. This time, Scout picked it up in his mouth and carried it back, dropping it at Frank's feet. The dog's eyes sparkled with something Frank couldn't quite name, maybe trust, maybe joy. Either way, it stirred something in him. Their daily walks became a ritual. At first, they only went as far as the edge of the driveway. But soon, they ventured farther down the street. Neighbors began to notice, waving or stopping to chat briefly. One elderly woman remarked, "Haven't seen you out and about like this in years. Frank, that dog's good for you." Frank shrugged, but he couldn't deny it. Something about Scout's presence had shifted his world. The quiet house didn't feel so empty anymore. The long afternoons that had once dragged on endlessly were now filled with training sessions, walks, and moments of quiet companionship. One day, as Frank was watering the garden, a man from down the street approached with a scruffy Labrador on a leash. "Hey, Frank," the man called. "I've been having trouble with this one. Heard you were good with dogs. Any tips?" Frank straightened, glancing at the Labrador, who was tugging at the leash and barking at a passing squirrel. "What's the problem?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. "Can't get him to listen. He's a rescue, came with a lot of baggage." Frank nodded, recognizing the weight behind the words. "Takes time," he said simply. "Start with the basics. Sit. Stay. Reward. Consistency is key." He demonstrated with Scout, who sat obediently at Frank's command. The man watched, nodding slowly. "Thanks, Frank. I'll give it a shot." Later that evening, as Frank sat on the porch with Scout curled at his feet, he thought about the conversation. Helping someone else had felt good, purposeful. Maybe there was more he could do. Scout had become more than just a companion. He was a link between Frank and the world he'd long since withdrawn from. Frank's children, who rarely called, were suddenly more frequent presences in his life. A simple video call with his daughter, where he introduced Scout, had turned into a long conversation about her own life, her struggles, and the grandkids Frank barely knew. "You look good, Dad," she said during one call. "Happier, I think." Frank glanced at Scout, who was lying on the floor beside him, tail wagging lazily. "Yeah," he replied, his voice softer than usual. "I've got some help around here." In quiet moments, Frank found himself wondering about Scout's past. The faint tattoo in the dog's ear haunted him, a reminder that Scout had once belonged somewhere, to someone. Frank began researching, piecing together what he could. He discovered records of military dogs, stories of their service, and accounts of those abandoned or retired after injuries. It didn't give him the full picture, but it confirmed what he'd suspected: Scout had been trained, likely as a service or rescue dog. Still, the details of Scout's life before their meeting seemed less important now. What mattered was the life they were building together. Frank had always thought of second chances as something other people got. But sitting with Scout in the warm glow of a summer evening, he realized he'd been wrong. "You saved me as much as I saved you," Frank said, scratching behind Scout's ears. The dog let out a contented sigh, his eyes closing as he leaned into Frank's touch. The idea came to him one morning while walking Scout. He passed the neighbor with the Labrador again, who waved and gave him a thumbs up. The dog was walking calmly by the man's side now, his leash slack. Frank smiled, a plan forming in the back of his mind. He wasn't sure where it would lead. But for the first time in years, he felt like moving forward. The morning light spilled through the kitchen window as Frank sat at the table, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. Scout rested at his feet, his breathing steady and content. Frank reached down to scratch the dog's ears, his touch light but deliberate. "Another day. Boy," he murmured. "Let's make it count." The small house felt less like a burden these days. The same walls that had once hemmed Frank and now seemed to hold purpose. Scout had made sure of that. Frank's routines were no longer solitary walks. Meals and quiet moments on the porch had become shared experiences, transforming his once lonely existence. The faint tattoo inside Scout's ear continued to linger in Frank's mind. On a whim, he had sent an inquiry to a registry for retired military dogs, attaching a photograph of the marking. He hadn't expected much, but an email had arrived days later, providing confirmation. Scout had been part of a search and rescue unit, deployed during natural disasters, injured in the line of duty. He had been discharged, his whereabouts untracked until now. Frank stared at the email again, his heart heavy with the thought of what Scout had endured. "Guess we're more alike than I thought," he said, glancing at the dog. Scout, sensing Frank's mood, nudged his leg gently, a silent reassurance. Inspired by this newfound understanding of Scout's past, Frank decided to attend a local veterans meeting. He hadn't been to one in years, but something about sharing Scout's story felt right. As he stood in front of the group, a mix of familiar faces and strangers, Frank hesitated, unsure of how to begin. Then he looked down at Scout, sitting obediently by his side, and the words came naturally. "I lost a lot of things after the war," Frank began, his voice steady but soft. "Friends, purpose, and, for a long time, myself. When I found Scout, or maybe when he found me, I didn't know what to expect. But this dog, he's reminded me of what it means to fight for something, to keep moving forward, even when it hurts." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. A man in the back nodded, his expression one of quiet understanding. Frank finished with a small smile. "Second chances don't always come easy. But when they do, you've got to grab hold of them." The applause was subdued but genuine, the kind that carried meaning. Afterward, several attendees approached Frank, some sharing their own stories of redemption, others asking about Scout. One man spoke quietly about a stray he'd been considering adopting but hadn't felt ready to commit to. Frank simply said, "Give it a shot. They've got a way of teaching us things we didn't know we needed to learn." In the weeks that followed, Frank found himself reconnecting with the community in ways he hadn't anticipated. Neighbors stopped by more often, drawn by Scout's presence and Frank's newfound openness. A woman with a nervous border collie asked for advice, and Frank offered to help her with training. It felt good, he realized, to be useful again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Frank sat on the porch with Scout by his side. The yard, though still a bit overgrown, felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. He tossed a ball into the garden, watching as Scout trotted after it, his limp barely noticeable now. The dog returned, tail wagging, and dropped the ball at Frank's feet. "You've still got it," Frank said with a chuckle, leaning down to scratch Scout's head. "Guess we both do." In that moment, an idea solidified, a plan for something bigger. Frank started jotting down notes in a worn notebook, sketching out the beginnings of a dog training program for veterans. It was an idea that had been forming ever since he'd helped his neighbor with their Labrador. And now it felt like the right time to act. "Maybe we can give a few more second chances," he said aloud, glancing at Scout. The dog tilted his head as if in agreement. As the evening settled into quiet, Frank looked out at the darkening sky. For the first time in years, he wasn't focused on what he'd lost but on what he'd found and what lay ahead. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" "Boy," he said softly. Scout leaned against him, his steady presence the only answer Frank needed.
Frank tossed the ball again, watching Scout retrieve it with a playful trot. "You saved me as much as I saved you," he said, Have you ever had a bond that changed your life? Share your thoughts and this story with others. Thanks for watching and see you in the